Welcome to the fourth video in our Quadcopter Building for Beginners Series 2. Now in the last video that we did, we actually put all the power system together. So now on this quadcopter we have all of the cables connected onto the power distribution board from all the ESCs, and the ESCs are all connected to the motors, and the motors are connected to the arms themselves. And we're just holding the ESCs on here with a bit of double-sided foam and also a little cable tie too. The other thing we've done is we've added the 5 volts and ground supply from the power distribution board that's going to run the actual flight controller. And we're almost at the point now where we can start putting the signals together. So in this video we're going to connect up 2 or 3 different things to our little flight controller in order for us to go to the next video where we can do things like set the model up on the Taranas and then flash the flight controller with Betaflight and then configure everything, and then we'll be almost ready to do a little bit of a test hover before adding the FPV kit. Now the flight controller itself, this is the one that we have been using so far. There is only a handful of connections that we're going to need to make. Now the connection for the receiver is going to be done with this cable here. This is IO1 on this side and this is IO2 on this side. We have a connector for VBAT. If we connect that to the main battery voltage, then the flight controller will be able to see that. Be very careful with polarity. That's the only place you should be plugging anything but 5 volts into a board like this. And then on the other side we have a connection for the buzzer. Now the buzzer is probably the first thing that we're going to have a look at. That's really easy to do. Then what we're going to do is talk about how we're going to connect up the signal cables for all of the motors that we installed last time. And then finally we're going to connect up our radio receiver, and by that point we'll be at the end of this video too. So the easy one is to connect up the buzzer. Now the buzzer itself and also the VBAT connections, if you check in the kit that you've got or very similar, you should have something like this, a little 2-wire plug. Now this will fit in either side into either the buzzer or into the VBAT connection, and all we did is we had 2 of these, and what I've done is I've connected this little lead to the top of the buzzer that we mounted here at the front. So there it is, ready to plug into the side, and I've just covered the top of those little soldered connections with a little bit of heat shrink. So that will just pop into the side when we get to that point. That's one of the easy bits. The next bit then is how we're going to connect each of the motors and the motor signal wires onto these outputs. Now if I just pop this flight controller, so that's the way that the model is laid out at the moment. The flight controller itself is going to fit on like that, okay, and the little buzzer is going to just plug into that connector at the side. Then what you have here is you have, unfortunately it becomes upside down, it's just the way that unfortunately the Seriously Pro is printed here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The outside pin is ground and the inside pin is signal. In fact, let me turn it the other way around and you'll be able to see that a little bit better. So here on the flight controller itself, we have all the ground wires are here at the very bottom, and this is pretty typical these days. Most of the flight controllers have all the ground pins on the outside. Then we have the plus 5 volt pin along the middle. Now these little leads that we have from our ESCs don't have the 5 volts in. That's why we have this extra little cable that we're going to plug into to output 8. We'll put the ground wire into the ground connection, the red wire into the middle connection, and that will then the 5 volts can power the flight controller. And then what we've got to do is for all of the motor wires, we're going to have to snip these off and then solder them into position. And again, we're doing that because we just don't have enough height to use pins here. If we could use the pins, then we'd use something like this to actually connect them all together. What we need to do is figure out which motor is which. So if I put it back down in the orientation that it is on the graphics, then the way this works is this is motor 4, this is motor 2, this one down here in this corner is motor 1, and this is motor 3. Now what we need to do then, of course, is plug them into the corresponding output. So starting with motor 1, which is this one down here, this lead from motor 1 is going to have to plug into output 1 here at the top of the board. The white signal wire is going to have to go into the signal pin of output 1, and the negative wire will go into the black wire will go into the negative connector here on the PWM motor outputs as well. The trick that I would give you here is, normally what I recommend is that you actually write here on the little servo lead that you've got the number of the motor that it corresponds to. But we're about to clip all these off because we're going to solder these onto the actual board itself. So what I've done is I'm using another little trick here that I'll share with you. So this motor here in the top of the screen is actually motor 4. And what I've done, hopefully the camera's picking that up, is I've just put 4 little dots in several places on the white wire so I can see that that is motor 4. This one here, for example, this motor here, which actually is going to be motor 2. If you look on here, you can see, hopefully the camera's picking it up, there are 2 little dots. I've put those in several places as well, and I've done that for the back rear motors. Motor 1 just has a single dot, and motor 3 has 3 dots. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to clip these wires off. I'm going to solder them into position. I'm going to solder this power cable into the end. Let me stop and do that and come back and have a look. I'm going to leave myself just a little bit of wiggle room, because obviously we do want to be able to remove the board if we need to get to the power distribution board to fix something, or maybe swap a damaged ESC. So let me pause the video there, do that, and we'll come back and have a look at what that looks like. Welcome back. So now, after a little bit of soldering, those main connections are done, and hopefully you can see on the board the outputs 1, 2, 3, 4. The white cables are all going to the signal wires, and the black cables from each of those ESCs are going to the negative wires. Now what I've done is I've pushed them through from the top, and then what I've done is actually soldered them here at the bottom. Hopefully you can just about make out that solder. And I've also connected the plus 5 volts and ground to the positive and the negative rail here, push those up through the top, and I have got those soldered. You can kind of see those 2 soldered bits there. So that, in theory, should be all the signal wires to the ESCs and motors, and also I've plugged in the buzzer too. Now be very careful when you are putting those wires in. I know I've said this before, but I'm going to re-stress it here. The way that the motors are laid out is very clearly shown in both the Clean Flight and Betaflight interfaces. Be really careful, because some other flight control software doesn't work in exactly the same way. So for example, these numbers here that we're looking at in the top left hand corner are not the same way if you're going to use Libre Pilot or another flight controller or something else. So double check the manual and follow along very carefully. You can see now underneath why I wanted that much room underneath the flight controller, because we've pretty much used all of it. I have popped that little bit of insulation tape on top of all the wires just to make sure that nothing's going to rub. There's nothing particularly sharp underneath this flight controller, but for my own peace of mind, I just want to make sure that it's all okay. So we're at a point now where I'm going to be able to bolt that flight controller down, and we can come back and play with it in the next part of the series. The last thing we need to do is then we need to make the wire connections for our receiver. Now we're going to use an OpenTX Taranis based radio here. We're going to use something like this, an X4R, or even an XSR, which is even slightly smaller, because we're going to connect using S-Bus. Now the reason we're going for S-Bus is mainly because it gives you the maximum number of channels and the lowest latency with a 3-wire connection. So it's dead easy to connect up, and it also is perfect if you want to fly quickly. Now in the kit that you get, there are 2 of these wires, one for IO1 and one for IO2, and you'll notice that 3 of the wires, or there should be, depending on the kit you've got, should be terminated into one cable like that, and that looks like a standard servo cable. All you do is you plug those first 3 wires into the S-Bus out connector of whatever receiver you're using, and that is it. You have made all the connections. I'm actually going to remove all these extra wires because we're not going to need them for the test and setup, but again, if you're interested in knowing what this board can do and using it to its full potential, then what I recommend is go and watch the Seriously Pro SP3 series that we have here on the channel. we do all kinds of things. We add things like LEDs and VBAT and all kinds of wacky stuff that we're not going to do in this series because this model is a little bit too compact for something like that. So go and have a look at that other series down here, and that will show you all of the extra things that you can do with these other wires, because they become something called soft serial ports, but we're not going to cover that in here. So now we are pretty much ready for the next video in the series. We have all of the connections made for each of the ESCs going into our flight controller, and we should just have enough room for us to be able to put the top plate on and fit everything in. Then we've also connected up the buzzer, just using that simple little red cable going into the buzzer at the front. And then finally we've connected up our radio receiver using the first 3 wires in this IO1 connection here at the side, because you get a couple of these things in the kit. There's the other one for IO2 that we're not using, and we're not going to use those others, so we're going to pull it. Now what will happen here is the white cable that we're looking at here will actually send all of the signals via the S-bus connection into the flight controller, and the red and black wires here will take the 5 volts that's coming up from the power distribution board into the receiver, so this is powered as well, so we don't need to make any more connections. So that is the majority of the donkey work done before we can start flashing this thing with Betaflight and starting the configuration. So join us in the next video, where what we're going to do is create a model on the radio and bind it to this X4R, and then we'll start to configure Betaflight onto this flight controller, make sure that all the basics are working, and then hopefully we'll be able to get to a test hover. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel, and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.